Welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name's Dan Moss and I'm the Manager of Practice Development here at Emerging Minds, and it's really great to be joined by all of you today. Before we start, we'd just like to recognise the lands on which we meet on today, pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and as the traditional owners of the lands that we work, play and work alongside throughout this country. We acknowledge and respect their traditional connections to their lands and waters, culture, spirituality, family and community for the well-being of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families. So welcome. We've got some really interesting conversations to be had today, but before we jump into that, I do have a little bit of housekeeping for you. Obviously today we're going to be talking about parents, talking with parents of children who have experienced child sexual abuse. So this can be quite a confronting topic, and which our panellists today will be talking about case examples where children have gone through child sexual abuse, and that can be confronting. So we just want to acknowledge that and just encourage you to look after yourself and take care of yourself, take time if you need it. These webinars are recorded and they are available in about 2 weeks on the aifs and the Emerging Minds website. So if you do need to take a break, then you won't miss anything. There's a live question and answer section at the end of this webinar in which we'll try to get through as many of your fantastic, I have to say, questions as possible. And questions via the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel can be received by us, so please keep those questions coming. There's related readings and resources referenced throughout this webinar. Again, they're available in the handouts tab of the GoToWebinar control panel. There's also a short feedback survey which will open at the end of this webinar. We'd love you to be able to fill that out and kind of give us some information around what's working well and what we could improve. The webinar will be live captioned. If you do require captions, please follow the link in the chat box for those captions. And I'd just like to also give a bit of a plug to a paper that aifs have just released. They've just published a practice guide on responding to children and young people's disclosures of abuse. So you can find this in the handouts tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. That's a really great resource and we hope that you find that useful. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking to our wonderful panelists about ways that we can help you to build your understanding of the impact of child sexual abuse on parents, the parent-child relationship, and children's mental health and well-being. We're going to help you to better support non-offending parents who are navigating their child's experience of sexual abuse, including making children's well-being central to the conversations that you have with parents, but in non-shaming ways. We want to help to develop practice skills that will allow you to support parents' well-being and parenting during the child's recovery period after child sexual abuse. So, as I said, we've got fantastic panellists today. Their bios are in the resources tab. So if you want to have a look at that, please do so. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but firstly, welcome to Alyssa Hall from the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. Alyssa, welcome. So wonderful to have you here today. Tell us a little bit about your work at the National Centre.
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be with Sophie and Carmela. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. So my role is Director of Practice Development and Engagement at the National Centre. For those who do or don't know, the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. So it's only been around a couple of years, so it's a new kid on the block in many ways. We have a singular focus on child sexual abuse and harmful sexual behaviour. That is our remit. We were evolved, I guess, in some ways. We're a key recommendation of the Royal Commission in 2017, and we were set up specifically to do a couple of things: raise awareness and understanding about child sexual abuse, support kind of help seeking guide best practice, and provide ongoing national leadership with others, collaborative leadership really, ultimately to improve responses, but also to prevent child sexual abuse. The National Centre is a partnership between 3 organisations that many of you will know, many of the audience I'm sure will know, who have really strong histories of leadership and responding in child sexual abuse, and that is the Australian Childhood Foundation, Blue Knot Foundation and the Healing Foundation. So we're really fortunate to have that strong foundations as part of the National Centre. I guess kind of really the things that we do in terms of the activities of the National Centre are a couple really to highlight. So generating and building and using evidence. So that looks like both commissioned and in-house research. We also have a real focus on evaluation of practice and service approaches to build our knowledge about what's working and what isn't working in service. Really important to say that when we talk about evidence, we define evidence really broadly and knowledge broadly in terms of expertise, experience, and evidence, and really from multiple knowledge sources, including, most importantly, people with lived experience. We then mobilise that knowledge into trying to build capability of a broad range of workers and community, and that looks like lots of different things, webinars, workshops, online courses, practical guides, blogs, those kinds of things. And then I suppose the other thing to note is just we really work collaboratively with other partners, really trying to change things at a more systemic level, because we acknowledge really we're standing on the shoulders of many advocates, organisations and individuals who've been in this space a long time. So that's us really. I am a social worker, a practitioner by background, have worked in service delivery as well as leading these capability kind of building work. So and I think that's enough from me, but I'm really looking forward to the chat. So thanks for having me, Dan.
Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks for joining us. Next up, I'm going to introduce Sophie McAvoy. Sophie does some wonderful work at Relationships Australia, South Australia, particularly with children and their parents before and after disclosures of child sexual abuse. Sophie, I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about what's important to you about your work with non-offending parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. So as Dan said, I'm the team leader for the Child Sexual Abuse Counselling Service and the Victims of Crime Counselling Service here at Relationships Australia, South Australia. So we work primarily with victims, but we also work with their families. That might be caregivers, siblings, the whole range of family members that we might see. And I guess what we notice when people come through the door, that first moment they make contact with us, is that they have minimal supports. They haven't really had a big base of people come around them in these moments. Often disclosures of child sexual abuse lead to isolation, lead to families pulling back, not having that kind of connection that they might need in those moments. And so we're wanting to step in and not only support the victim, but provide some support to the parent. And the other reason that's really important, and we'll go into this more throughout today, I'm sure, but the parent is really the central person for that child. The parent is going to be there day after day after day. We might be there fortnightly, once every 3 weeks, once every month, depending on how often we're seeing the child, but the parent is there as the main support. They're providing the feedbacks in moments of distress, in moments of emotional upset, when there are further disclosures, and these are all things we need to be able to help parents kind of manage as they go forward on this journey, and we can help them alongside helping their child.
Thanks, Sophie. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Camilla Bastian. Camilla has worked for a long time in child protection and academia, and now directs her own consultancy service. Camilla, welcome. In your work with parents, how do you enact child-focused practice in a way which is supportive of the parent as well as the child?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Firstly, I'd like to say it's a real privilege to be here today with Sophie and Alyssa. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Perry-Monk people in the Adelaide Hills and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Dan said, my practice, I've been predominantly working for over 20 years in frontline child protection in both South Australia and the Northern Territory. and the last 10 years involved in academia, research and teaching, and now in private practice. So really important, I think it's critically important that we work with parents. As Sophie said, the parent is central to ensuring that children engage in healing and recovery. So in the context of child sexual abuse and any other form of maltreatment, we need to be working with parents. So when we think about practice that's child-centred or child-aware, it's centering the child in all aspects of our work. When we're working with parents, about holding their experiences, their voices and views of children in our conversations with parents in all aspects of assessment and developing interventions to make sure that they are safe and that their developmental, cultural and wellbeing needs are met. So even though working with parents is important, it's important to make sure that we bring the voice of the child into all those conversations. We need to work closely with parents to make sure that they have the resources, that they are strengthened and empowered to meet the complex needs of children. So we know from research and practice experience, and many of you out there know this and you experience this, that parents who are attuned, supportive and responsive to their child's needs within a context of child maltreatment, they can achieve positive outcomes for the child and also the parent-child relationship. And I'm sure we'll explore all that much further today.
Thank you to our three panellists, and thank you again to all of the questions that have come in prior to this webinar. It was really actually all of the questions that we're going to ask our panellists today have come from you. There was hundreds of really insightful and sophisticated questions that came through. So thank you for that. We're going to do our best to get through a few of them now. And I want to start, a lot of the questions talked about the practices that actually support parents to describe their shock, anger, guilt that can follow or even come before a disclosure of child sexual abuse. So how do we support parents to do that? But as Camilla said, still maintaining a focus on what their child needs from them. Sophie, I might start with you in terms of your own practice in being able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think what Camilla was saying is really important. Obviously, the child needs to stay at the centre. But one of the pitfalls we kind of see parents fall into is thinking that if I'm going to get support for my child, that means I don't need or can't get support for myself. And we'll use that oxygen mask metaphor. If we are going to put on our child's oxygen mask, we need to put our own on first. We need to be able to breathe, think clearly, have the knowledge and skills on board ourselves before we can do that for our child or alongside. So one of the practical ways we do that is always have a parent-only session first. So we don't have the parent and child together in the first session. We find that really opens the conversation. We're still centering, what's happened for the child, what's gone on here, what are the reactions that you're concerned about, but also how are you as a parent? This is huge. This has impacted probably every aspect of your life at this point. So we're validating and normalizing their responses alongside also getting some information about how the child's doing. And from there on moving forward, we might offer individual sessions for the parent. We might also offer individual sessions for the child. And there's a lot of conversation around how that works for that individual family. Is that with the same counsellor or separate counsellors? Depending on the age of the child, is the parent in the room or not in the room? And this is an ongoing conversation to really put their needs and what that individual family needs first. So I think that's how we start here.
Great, thanks, Sophie. Alyssa, what about for you in terms of your own practice, but also what you've learned from your work at the centre?
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree with Sophie more. I suppose just kind of picking up on some of the points that Sophie's made. We know through both experiences that people have had, but also through the literature that feeling believed by a parent and feeling well supported by a parent is one of the strongest protective factors against long-term mental health impacts. We know that. So I guess just underscoring the importance, that Sophie has talked about around that balance and really supporting a parent to understand their own kind of health needs and their own care needs in that period of time, so that they in fact can care for their child and put the child first. And I think just again to remember that disclosure from a child is not most often not a linear kind of one-off, neat, tidy situation where a child will come and we do it, we disclose, and then we move on. All situations are unique, but it's often messy. It's often over time. It's often little bits of information, and I guess so. You kind of just understanding for a parent, it can be really confusing. And it is a crisis situation. The consequences once a disclosure happens are enormous. They are ongoing and they turn a family upside down. They can be public with court processes. They can be isolating. So I think, really helping a parent to understand that impact and normalize those feelings of shock and anger and guilt and confusion and disbelief, and there is some increased recognition really in the literature that non-offending parents are secondary victims of child sexual abuse, and kind of thinking about that when we're working with the family unit. I guess they're kind of some of the key things. I suppose thinking about some practical things. And Sophie started to talk about some of those in terms of the approach and how you might work with both children separately and then with parents together. But I think, some of the things around, helping parents to manage their own feelings in a healthy way, but also helping parents to understand what trauma looks like, what the impact of trauma is on a child and what that means for their parenting in an ongoing way. There is kind of some support and education around, what does this mean, this experience, this trauma, this betrayal? What is the impact that's going to happen for my child and for my parenting and for my family, and how they kind of navigate those challenges together. And I suppose just recognizing that it's a long journey. It's a long journey together. So I'll pause there because I know Carmela's got lots to add as well.
Yeah, please. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Camilla, particularly from a child protection perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Sophie and Alyssa have said. It is a really, coming from a child protection perspective, obviously, sometimes, many child protection workers can relate to having to break the news to parents that a disclosure has been made. So right at that very moment, it is a significant event when this happens. It's a huge crisis. And it can, it is traumatic, and how a parent or carer behaves or responds is very difficult to predict. So, in that child protection context, we have to, workers have to be ready for a variety of responses. Not every parent is going to respond the same because there's so many complexities that impact on that response. So the challenge in these situations, as Sophie and Alyssa have already said, is that you need to respond to the parents or carers. You need to really engage with them, engage with their reaction and their trauma and their emotions at that particular time. But simultaneously, you need to also make sure that you can that the child is going to be safe, because you don't know you don't know how the parent or carer is going to respond, how in terms of their investment in the relationship with the perpetrator. There's all those considerations to go through. So during the conversations, it needs to be a really trauma-informed approach. There needs to be really compassionate response, understanding of that response. and also making the plans to ensure safety and those practical considerations for children, so that they are not propelled into this blaming atmosphere, really trying to make sure the situation is protective for them as well.
Yeah, thanks,
And
Camilla.
Dan,
Sorry, Alice.
can I just add to that? Just to pick up on what Carmela has just said, I think, we also know from research and from experience that, many, certainly some, if not many, non-offending parents have their own trauma history. So, and there are maybe other things circling around in the family context or the family culture or the family environment that impact both the response, but also how you support that family. So I think kind of understanding all of those other contextual pieces, and whether that's a history of child sexual abuse for the parent, or it's a current kind of family violence, or coercive control, or some other factor that's impacting the family unit and the support, that can be offered. I think that's a really important kind of just component to add in.
Thanks, Alyssa. Camilla, if I can just go back to you, given your experience in child protection, we've had quite a few questions around working with parents who are still in a relationship with the perpetrator, whether that be a relationship, be a family member or a partner. Can you provide us with some insight in terms of how you go about that?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. This is, it's a really difficult situation and very, very challenging in responding to these situations. In my experience, the parent, and I just want to highlight Alyssa's point that she just made, the parent who continues a relationship with the perpetrator is really torn between their relationship needs, the loyalty to their partner, if it is their partner or whoever the perpetrator is, and also the other complexities that are in that family, and their own experience about, if they have experienced childhood trauma as well, that all comes into play. And there's, as I said previously, there's no one size fits all approach. Every situation is going to be unique. However, there are some guiding principles that I've always used in my practice. So always child safety and best interest must come first. It's important to build an alliance with that non-offending parent to understand their position, but also ensure that they're aware or in tune with what the child's situation, and all of them engage in healing and recovery in a therapeutic response. So I just want to talk through, I remember a particular situation, a young woman who was 13 years of age and had been raped by her stepfather, and her mother totally rejected her, did not believe that it happened, despite the really clear evidence that it had. There was no extended family. The young woman was placed in out-of-home care. She didn't do well initially, and she developed quite severe depression and was suicidal. So in circumstances of rejection, so my first instance and priority was to ensure that this young woman was safe and supported. But I continued to work with the parent because her initial reaction was of rejection. But I needed to work with her around practical arrangements, but also try and promote some connection between them, because you always want to think about the long-term parent-child relationship. That in that moment, the reaction can be one of rejection or minimising, which we are going to talk about, but then you need to think about long-term. So my approach was not to judge the mother. I spent time with her and to understand where she was coming from. So I took a really curious and compassionate stance. And in doing that, sitting with her, listening to her, I found that she herself had experienced childhood trauma and childhood sexual abuse, and she was rejected by her family. Her decision to continue a relationship with the perpetrator was her need to feel supported in that moment. And she didn't have the strength at that time to deal with the triggering again, or the reliving of her experiences. So it was a very complex situation. We ended up having conversations. The daughter and the mother were engaged in therapeutic intervention, and they did develop a relationship. They were able to continue that connection. In the end, the perpetrator left the family home. They were able to build relationships, and they did, in the longer term, were able to live together again. Now, this was a positive outcome, even though it didn't start out as quite positive. But it's about really listening, understanding, and taking that real trauma-informed approach.
Wonderful case example. Thanks, Carmela. Sophie, I wonder for you, like in the course of your work, whether you're working with parents who do continue a relationship with the perpetrator, and what sort of conversations you have in a therapeutic sense.
Yeah. It's a very different setting, and for us, not the most usual. I think that's something to point out here, is that there are the majority of parents, the majority of caregivers do respond and believe the child and act on that. But in situations, say, where that's not the case, like Carmela said, the first step is to hold that judgment, to not respond from a place of judgment and assumptions, I guess, about where the parent is coming from. Really, what we're wanting to do is take a few steps back and step into curiosity. We want to understand what's going on for that parent and that family. Alyssa was talking about context before. We don't know the history here. We've just met these people. And so we really want to get to understand that. And one of the ways we think about that is this kind of analogy of the parent and the family have landed in a deep hole. And they're at the bottom of the hole, and they are overwhelmed, and they just cannot find the way out, and they're looking around. And so if we as a practitioner come to the top of that hole and look down, and we think, oh yeah, it looks pretty bad down there, and we don't kind of ask into, how did you get there? What were the thoughts that led to perhaps staying with that person? What's the financial situation that's led you to make these decisions? What are the factors that have contributed really to you being here now? Then we really can't help them out of the hole. We need to get down to the bottom. We need to be able to look around with them and find the way out. And I think that curiosity has to extend then to the child, and keeping the child in the room even when they're not there. So with the parent, in a gentle, non-judgmental way, asking into, okay, so, you've chosen to stay with so-and-so, and what does that look like for your child? What's the situation there? And how might that look going forward? What impact do we think that might have? We might come back to what we know. We might say, what we know is that children who are believed and who have those disclosures acted upon in a really straightforward way do have better outcomes. And we see that. We might go back to what we know about children and telling the truth in these situations, and that a vast majority of children are telling us what really has happened in their lives. They don't have the knowledge to make this up out of nowhere. So something's happened here. So we might rely on some of our knowledge, but we also want to approach that in such a gentle and curious way with parents. We don't want to push them away and have them not telling us what's really going on for them. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sophie. Alyssa, I want to move now to the research that you've done at the National Centre, and particularly about what it tells us about community understandings about child sexual abuse. How might these understandings, for example, be helpful, or in some cases not so helpful for parents? And what does this mean for specialists or actually non-specialist practitioners?
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, it's really interesting. So we've undertaken quite, as I mentioned earlier, we've commissioned a program of research, but we've also undertaken a community attitudes study, wave one of a community attitudes study, to really Australian based, to really understand, I guess, the community's attitudes, which helps us to understand awareness and stigma and all of those related components, which we've talked a little bit about. And I want to come back also to your question about specialists versus kind of generalists or other kind of practitioners. But really, some of the things that we've learned from that is that there is, interestingly, there is some indication from that data that Australians have a pretty reasonable knowledge around the prevalence of child sexual abuse, common perpetrator types, risky settings. There is a level of awareness, a reasonable level of awareness. What's interesting is underneath that, and then the what next. So what we learned from a data perspective is that less than 10% of Australian adults had received a disclosure from a child or discovered child sexual abuse. And of those, less than half had reported having a supportive conversation or notifying authorities. So we're talking very small numbers of people who are receiving, discovering, or acting on disclosures. There's very clearly a low level of confidence within this kind of context. So a quarter of people reported not being confident at all to identify child sexual abuse indicators or to start to have a conversation where they are concerned. They think a child might be being harmed. So there's a pretty low baseline level of confidence around having conversations and also then acting. So that's in a broad community population base of which we all exist. So workers, practitioners, we all exist. We sit in that. There are also some interesting and really, I guess, concerning findings and reinforcement of messages around myths, including victim blaming, particularly for adolescents, and also around a child's lack of credibility, so a child's not being believed. And we know there are all kinds of things that sit around that, as Sophie and Camilla have talked about, but this evidence tells us that right now, these harmful attitudes still exist. They still have an impact on the way that we as a community protect children and respond to harm that they might be experiencing. So I think in terms of thinking about kind of implications, I think one of it is we clearly there's an issue about confidence in having conversations. We know that this is reinforced by this data. I think also it reinforces the importance of safety planning and I guess not necessarily in a clinical assessment safety planning, but understanding the basics about safety, how to, as a parent, think about basic safety mechanisms and a safety plan with your child walking home from school. What does that mean? What does that look like? Very basic safety. And risk identification. How do we help parents to understand, hone in where they think that there is risk and then actually do something about that? So I think there are a few things that are really clear around a population base. So prevalence is not the concern, it's the confidence and knowing what to and how to act. They're where we need to kind of, I guess, prioritize and focus our efforts. And I suppose I just wanted to just make one comment about the specialist versus generalist. I think that we have to really, really remember that it is incumbent and necessary and required, and there is no other way to prevent harm on children unless we all have an active response and we're activated in this. This is not just for specialist workers. This is not just a role for specialist clinicians. So I think understanding from a generalist worker or for volunteers at sporting clubs, for GPs who are seeing families and seeing children, for teachers, for childcare workers, for all of us collectively. There are different responsibilities, of course, but there is absolutely, this data is clear, and I think we know from these conversations that we're having, it's really important that we don't, as a generalist worker, so a non-specialist worker, go, well, that will be picked up by a specialist. We'll refer on That's our action, or we won't do anything because we know we think someone else will pick that up, or we hope someone else will pick that up, and it's a specialist, because we're negating that responsibility and we're not protecting children. So I think it's really important to remember that this is a shared responsibility.
That,
Thank you so much.
I was, sorry, I
I
was
see
just going to
Sophie nodding, and Carmela too.
I was just going to say that adage about it takes a village is really true, isn't it? I think we hear that a lot, but it actually is very, very accurate about, that's the whole of society's responsibility to make sure children are safe. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, what you said, Alyssa, about, oh, well, someone else will pick this up if we refer on.
Yeah.
That's well and good, but if we think about the client's experience of that, if we think about the child or the parent who's chosen to disclose in that moment to a trusted practitioner in a generalist service, perhaps, their experience is one of safety in that moment. They feel enough safety to disclose what's happened. And if we move immediately to referral, the message we're giving is almost, that wasn't the right decision. And what we want people to walk away with after disclosure is, I'm believed, I've been heard, I made a good decision to tell that person about what's happened in my life, and they're going to take some actions that are going to either keep us safer or move us towards healing and recovery. So yeah, I think really important point, Alyssa.
Yeah. And I think I just want to pick up on Sophie's point there is, even though, we think about, there's child protection and there's a therapeutic response, I think we need to look at it as it should always be therapeutic, no matter, and really trauma informed along the whole continuum. And I know that it's not always the case, but we really, really need to think about what can we do to make it the best experience possible for the family and the child. Yeah.
Yeah, some really wonderful points there. Thank you all. Sophie, I'm going to move on to you now within the context of your own work. I imagine lots of the parents, and probably often particularly mums who come and visit with you, have got long histories of being invited into shame or stigma. How do you go working with these people in collaborative and respectful ways that obviously centres the needs of the child, but also avoids the reproduction of this shame?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you're kind of echoing a little bit what Alyssa and Carmela were saying earlier about parents coming with their own histories of potentially child sexual abuse, but also other forms of violence and abuse that have happened in their lives. And so these things are sitting with them, and they've absorbed those ideas in society that, we're all kind of sitting in these ideas that society provides us about why abuse happens and who it happens to and who perpetrates it. And so one thing we can do to begin with is to start to make that stuff really visible in the room. We want to have conversation around it. And you can do that in many different ways. One way we talk about it within this service is talking about the book of myths, lies, and bullshit that happens within child sexual abuse. And that's really just a pretty slang way of saying a lot of the things that we have heard in society about why this stuff happens is not true. It's victim blaming. It comes back to the responsibility being with the individual who was abused. So we can start to listen for that. If we're aware of it, that's the first thing, us being aware of it. If we're aware of it, we can start to listen and then ask into it more in the room to make those ideas more visible. So we want people to come in and be able to express those ideas to us and leave thinking maybe, maybe it didn't really matter that the curfew was 9:30 and not 8:30. Perhaps that wasn't the reason that happened that night. Maybe if that person was a safe person for them to be around, this abuse wouldn't have occurred. So one thing we can do is make things really visible. And linked to that, I think, is really making clear the perpetrator tactics. So we often talk about what happened. We talk about the impact on the victim. I think most of us are a little bit more comfortable perhaps sitting in that space and processing in that way. But we can also really make clear what the perpetrator did over time that led to the abuse occurring, and also for the parents that led to the abuse not being seen. because parents come in with this shame and this self-blame around, I should have known, I should have seen this, why didn't I pick up on what was happening earlier? And we want to ask into that, because there are real reasons why these things are hidden. You know, maybe mum was working 2 jobs, working a lot of overtime, with a partner who didn't work and who had offered to stay home and look after the children. You know, we can really ask into some of the factors that led to this stuff not being seen. And in those ways, rather than just saying, this wasn't your fault, we're saying this wasn't your fault because of X, Y, and Z. And we can do the same for the blame that lies on the children in this case as well. You know, if they're holding ideas about their children having done things that led to this happening, we can break that down for them too, so they can provide these ideas back to their kids.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. Camilla, I wanted to ask you, a bit like what Sophie was saying there, how important is it for you to understand what parents are already doing or have done to support their children in ways which might, go against these myths or lies that Sophie was describing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens when you're working in the child protection sector and in, with child abuse and neglect is we can be really focused on risk and also have a very deficit approach in our thinking. And it's really important to recognise that there are strengths in families that we work with. And some of them have the most incredible strength that that I've been in awe of. So it's really the important question is to recognise and validate what parents are already doing to support their children. It might be something that we hadn't expected or wasn't visible to us, but we need to ask the question and really engage with the parents. Even in situations where there's ambivalence about the disclosures, the parents are still providing that support. So building an alliance with the parent or the carer and understanding what they're doing to support the child is really reflective of taking a strengths-based approach. And building that alliance is also empowering and gives them the confidence to then keep doing what they're doing or building on what they're doing to keep the child safe. So it's not only trying to support their child, but it's also, in this context where there has been disclosures, parents lose their confidence. They question, as Sophie said, they will start to question their own parenting, what they did wrong. When in actual fact, in many circumstances, they weren't aware of that real subtle, the grooming behaviour and the, taking opportunities that were there to abuse, harm children. So it's really important to engage with parents to, that they are doing that they have strengths and build on those strengths and strengthen their role as a parent.
Thanks so much, Camilla. I'm wondering, Alyssa, I know at the Centre you do quite a bit of research on grooming, and Camilla mentioned that there. So how do we talk to parents about the grooming process that has so often occurred for their child in ways which might help them to support their child and themselves?
Thanks, Dan. And I think it links, to what Sophie and Carmela have been talking about as well. I would just reiterate that importance. I think, Carmela, particularly you, are around, kind of building on the strengths of a parent. Because actually protective factors and trying to understand what that looks like within the context of that family, which is different, families are different, and trying to rebuild a parent's sense of kind of confidence and agency, really, which they may very well have lost depending on the context of, the environment that they're in. I think, moving into the grooming area, I think it picks up on Sophie's point around, I suppose, there's an education piece for parents around understanding what grooming is understanding that it is purposeful, it is intentional, it is tactical, it is manipulative, so I think those things are really important, and that often the grooming is not only for targeting a child, it's targeting a parent, it's targeting a unit, it's targeting a whole collective, and that's how it is so tactical. So I think there's a real kind of education piece to understand it, to arm people with an understanding, and that then helps to combat some of these kind of feelings and concerns, and normal feelings and concerns of guilt, and how did I miss it, and how did I not pick up the signs, and the level of shame that people feel around that. So I think there's an education piece around what it is, what it means, what it looks like. I think there's an education piece around helping people to understand, as parents, they were part of the grooming, they were part of that tactic, and I think that the strategic kind of element, at the strategic approach, and I suppose in some ways normalizing, because of that, because of the tactical kind of approach to grooming, normalizing missed warning signs, normalizing why things might not have been picked up, why that didn't seem like an alarm bell, why that didn't raise more shackles or hackles than you thought it should have. So I think because we'll often have parents who might say, I had a gut feel about something, and because there's all kinds of other reasons to combat that gut feel or to combat that suspicion. So I think there is a lot of work to do, not just for non-offending parents, but certainly in the context that we're talking about, but very broadly about grooming, to help, because when you're talking about a protective network and a protective system and kind of community around that child, even outside of the family unit, we all have to understand grooming. And I think it's incredibly important to healing and recovery, and to a parent's ability to be able to support the healing and recovery of their child, to understand what happened, what grooming looked like, and how it was connected to them, not just connected to their child. So that's just a couple of comments, I suppose. I can see Sophie ready to jump in.
Yeah, can I jump in there? Because I was thinking what you were saying about it not just being the individual, it being the family, and even extending that out to the community. We work statewide in South Australia, so we work with lots of regional and rural communities. And what we see is that we start working with one client where there's been a recent disclosure, and then it will bleed out into many families within the community who are all interlinked in some way with this one offender. And that offender has done a good job of grooming the community, really. They might be very involved in the school or in sports clubs. They're known, they're trusted in a way. And so really highlighting how that comes into play is important. And actually parents then can join together, and having that peer connection is really important for parents. They can come together and say, okay, wow, we all didn't see this. This must mean it was very, purposeful, very targeted, and they can kind of find support in that way. I think peer support can't be underestimated.
Thanks, Sophie. You've all made some really great points today about this practice being important, not just for specialist practitioners, but non-specialist practitioners. Camilla, what are the supervision implications for this? What's important for specialists or non-specialists who are having these conversations with parents? What's important for them to receive in supervision, do you think?
This is a really big question, so I might try and be brief, but I think clinical supervision, for anyone that's working in this sector, is really critically important. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of receiving supervision. I'm of the firm belief that if the child protection workforce, or any workforce that works, or we're talking in the context of working with families and children who experience child maltreatment, if the workforce feels safe, trusted and nurtured, those feelings and that culture transfers into the work that we do with children and families. So supervision needs to be trauma informed. It needs to be, workers need to be able to sit in a space where they feel safe, where they feel they can trust the person who is their supervisor, and they can reflect, question, and be in tune not only with their own emotions, but also working through some of these situations in a reflective and trusted way. Supervision needs to be mutually beneficial, and it also needs to be an opportunity to share information and knowledge so that they also, like children, like parents, that they feel empowered and heard. I think if we have a culture within organisations where supervision and people feel safe, then I think we have better outcomes for children and families.
Yeah, wonderful, Camilla. Sophie, I'm wondering in your supervision practice whether you have something that you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think Carmela has covered a lot of it. We do individual supervision as well as group supervision, and I think our group supervision where we all get together is a really rich space where we can reflect openly and ask questions that perhaps we wouldn't ask in other settings. But I think a big part of this as well in having non-specialist practitioners join us in this space and being more comfortable is that we all have a role to play in destigmatizing, talking about child sexual abuse. I know for myself, when I started in this role and people would ask what I did, I would hesitate because I knew what was coming on the other end was oh, okay. And so I, for a little while, didn't say exactly what I did, but now I'm really open about it and I want to have those conversations. And I think that's all of our responsibility to be out there talking about this, making sure that everyone's aware that this is going on. We know the statistics. It's 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys. We know the stats. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
I think I couldn't agree more, Sophie, and I think it links back to kind of what we've had reinforced through the community attitude study, but just the confidence to have the conversation, all of us. And I think, how we as workers support parents to have the conversation. Parents are often fearful that they'll say something to make it worse or say something to upset or say the wrong thing. And that stops us from saying anything. So, having the confidence to have the conversation is important. I just wanted to add just a couple of things around the kind of supervision and support for practitioners. And one is I think that we also need to think about the culture of the organisation, that it cannot just be on the individual practitioner. And absolutely there needs to be individual supervision, and whether that's group or in different settings. But I think there also is a requirement for us to think about the culture and the context of the organisation, the leadership of the organisation, how it is a safe and supported organisation. And one of the reasons, there are many reasons to enable good practice, to enable good reflection, to enable learning, all of those things that we know are important, and to cope with, often very, very difficult situations. But I think the other is to remember that workers, we are all part of the Australian community. We know that workers themselves are also victims and survivors, a high proportion. So we did a learning and development survey a couple of years ago, had about 1,400 responses. 33% of people identified as having a lived experience, with another 11% not responding. We know that a third, more probably, of workers in this space have their own lived experience. So there is supervision about, the way you do your work, but there is a supervision and a support of you as a human, and everything that you bring to that as well. And I think that's really important to think about the workforce and the what's made up of the work, who we are made up of that workforce, and then the organisation's responsibility, therefore, in supporting that workforce.
And just thinking, Alyssa, about the non-specialist workforce and the workforce more generally.
Yeah.
Like, this idea that you touched on before of, the strongest thing, or the strongest response we can provide, is just believing children or parents, or just listening. Like, in your work at the centre, how useful is that kind of information for practitioners to help them to develop confidence in having these conversations?
Yeah, look, I think it's incredibly useful, and I think I think there's a couple of things. Probably is one to how we help everybody to understand they have a responsibility, regardless of the role that they play. But everybody who interacts with children or young people or families, whether they're in a specialist role or whether they are a GP or an educator, they are part of this response and protection that we need to have for children. There is no way that children are protected only through a specialist, lens. So, one of the things we've also learned is, so how do we build that confidence? What does it look like? And one of the things I think is about normalizing that these are tricky. It's okay to feel a bit fearful. It's okay to not, to feel a level of anxiety about this. What we have to then figure out is, how are you not paralyzed and therefore do nothing? Therefore, do not create a safe environment for a child to talk to you. Therefore, do not act if a child does talk to you, or they tell you a little bit, but then they're shut down and they don't tell you the rest, and they don't get the help that they need. So, how do we normalize that this is uncomfortable, but also build enough confidence to not be paralyzed by that? And I think there are some practical things. We've done some work around, and many others have as well, around, practical prompts. What are the things? Because what people say is, what do I say? Like you say, have a conversation. What do I actually say, though, when you say have a conversation? So, even things like, asking a direct question. I'm concerned. I've noticed. There's lots of things that we can help and provide practical help for people to build that confidence a little bit. And I think it's also to remember, we're not trying to turn everybody into specialist practitioners. We're not trying to turn everybody into, therapeutic experts, where it's also not people's job to collect the evidence. It's not a person's job, an adult's job, to find the evidence in order to believe. Their job is to believe and act and to respond. It's not to know that you've got enough evidence to do that. That isn't the job of a person, most generally. So I'm talking outside of the context of, particular contexts around child protection and investigation type of roles. But so I think there's some, the real practical things around normalizing challenging conversations, giving people language actually to open up the discussion, giving people an avenue to talk to others, to learn. How do we keep building and learning from the experiences that we're having? So I think there's lots of things. And, the reality is, actually, children talk to people they trust. That's who they tell, that's who they talk to. And, that's often a mum, that's often, it could be a friend, but it may be a really good teacher. And many others. So thinking about the people in a child's life who are trusted are not specialist workers. That's not who it is. And it's not that doesn't get there, but I think we have to arm this workforce, normalise how challenging it is, and provide practical tools for them.
Thanks, Alyssa. I reckon we're going to have to finish the Q&A session there, unfortunately, because I'm sure you'll agree with me that the information and the insights that Dr. Camilla Bastian, Alyssa Hall and Sophie McAvoy have been able to provide for us today have been really invaluable to practice, and really hope that specialist and non-specialist practitioners among you have found this as useful as I have. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, so thanks Camilla, Alyssa and Sophie. I just also like to thank, as I said before, the audience, for all of you. We've had many thousands actually, of registrants for this particular webinar. And as I said before, the questions that you're able to provide us really helped us to sit down and think critically about what would be most useful to discuss throughout the past hour and in our post-webinar Q&A session that we'll do in a while. So thank you for that. And I think what they reflected is a real sophistication of what's being thought about out there, and certainly certainly a striving among practitioners to be able to support parents and to be able to bring these issues out into the open, and particularly to be having non-stigmatizing and non-shaming conversations, but those conversations that still support the best interests of children's mental health. Thanks also to Aaron and Laura, who have helped us really excellently as part of the aifs communication team and the Child and Family Evidence and Evaluation team. Please subscribe to either the aifs or the Emerging Minds websites and newsletters to be notified about the recording of this webinar if you're interested in that. Reminder to everyone also, please fill out the feedback survey at the end of this webinar in a few seconds' time. We've really enjoyed meeting with you all today. Thank you so much. We look forward to our next webinar in this series on infant and child mental health with aifs and Emerging Minds. Take care, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Camilla.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, Dan.
Welcome back, everybody, to this extended panel Q&A session where we're talking about supporting parents of children who have disclosed child sexual abuse. We have had a plethora of questions come through before and during the webinar, which we're very grateful for, and we're going to try to get to some of those now, including lots of questions pertaining to supporting parents who are going through legal processes throughout our courts, and I was just recognising that this is a very big area and a very nuanced area. I wonder, Alyssa, if you would like to respond to this question that we have.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to, Dan, just make a general comment, really. I think just to pick up on your comment there, it's obviously a pretty complex area, and all situations are, incredibly different with different kind of contexts and variables that are sitting in that make a huge impact. I think one of the things, we know from working with victims and survivors and parents of victims and survivors is how challenging the family law system is, and the judicial system in general, how challenging it is for victims and survivors and for families in terms of the way that it operates, in every possible facet of the way that it operates. I guess one of the things that I would probably say, so I wouldn't necessarily think it's something for us to talk about in terms of giving direct advice, but I think one of the things that I would just flag when we're talking about non-offending parents in particular, and we're thinking about the consequences and the intersection with family law courts, is the real challenges, risks, dangers for parents, particularly women, around what can face them in a family law context around not keeping children safe, not being a protective parent, not acting protectively, and other risks that actually are very real in terms of the consequences that may then occur, and then further consequences on children when parents are actually, pulled into these different kind of elements about being a non-protective parent. So, and I guess just the discrimination, kind of that kind of sits in that kind of system, and acknowledged by the system, I think, quite often when interacting with, particularly with different population groups. So we're talking about First Nations communities and other cultural groups. They are not systems, family is not necessarily systems that understand the needs of different cultural groups or different groups, in any way. So I guess I would just acknowledge it's really fraught, really challenging, and it can have an impact on a non-offending parent's response and, how they behave because of the risks and the dangers that exist there. But I think other than that, I think we're getting into the territory of talking in more kind of specifics. But I do think the intersection's important to acknowledge, and the impact that might have on the way a non-offending parent behaves.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. That's a great answer. Thanks, Alyssa. Sophie, we've had quite a few questions on the subject of sexual abuse that occurs by siblings, and whether you had some practice advice on how you might talk to families or parents about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks everyone for asking into this area. I think you know, perhaps if not working in a specialist service, it's something that you wouldn't see all that often, but actually I think it is more common than we know. And we do see it quite often within the service. And it just adds another layer of complexity. Parents are already responding to a very difficult situation. They're already thinking about how to support their child and experiencing that shock. But now layered on top of that, there's also perhaps more shame, you know, that is their child. There's a grief and loss around the family structure as it was, often a recognition that it can't continue in that moment in the same way as it has been. And there are lots of practical difficulties that all of a sudden arise for parents. You know, there are safety concerns, and as Carmela has said throughout today, placing the safety of the victim at the centre is really our priority. And so if we place them at the centre here, then we're needing to make adjustments in that household and in how that household functions that mean the other sibling might have to live elsewhere, or arrangements might need to be made. And support needs to be in place for both children, obviously, as well, going forward. I was thinking about a family I'd worked with where the child who had been perpetrating the abuse had been located outside of the home after the disclosure with the dad, who was not a particularly safe person. And so this actually just added to the non-offending parents' worries, concerns, you know, what they were managing, because they were torn really between their safety concerns for one child and the need for healing and recovery for the other child. And so there was a lot of work there around what are the practical things we can get in place to ensure that the perpetrating sibling is in a safe space. They're still a child. Their safety needs to be placed at the centre as well. They also need support. They need to be able to access the right service. But then we need to come back to the child who's been victimised here, because they still need to feel like what happened to them was not okay, that they're believed, that they're heard, and that their needs are really prioritised here. And they can't be asked to prioritise the needs of the offending sibling ahead of their own. So it's a really tricky space. We talked earlier about holding your judgment. That's, again, really important here. And we talked about curiosity and just asking into it. It's a strange space. You might not have had a situation like this before, but if you can ask gentle, caring, open questions to parents about what's happening here, how they're feeling, how they've responded so far, they've probably put a lot of safety things in place already. We can start to build structure from there and go forward. We never want them to think that we want them to distance that other child from their own heart or, you know, from their mind, but they do need to react in the safety interests of the victim.
Thanks for that, Sophie. Such a great answer. Camilla, we've obviously spoke a lot about grooming throughout the webinar. Just some follow-up questions about that, in particular about how can parents and community members provide protection for children where grooming has been identified?
It's a really good question. I just want to reiterate what Alyssa said earlier in the webinar, is that perpetrators who engage in quite specific strategic grooming practices are very skilled people. Certainly in my practice, it is sometimes it takes a lot of investigation or understanding about those tactics, and it is very hard to pinpoint. So there's lots of different tactics that are used. I mean, children can be fearful, or you have an adult who might actually be incredibly friendly with the child or children, and there's always secrecy that's attached to those behaviours as well. Quite, very, very embedded secrecy. So, and I think these days, obviously, there's always the online groomers that have caught, people are really worried about. If, children might say things like that they feel uncomfortable or they're not sure of someone, we really need to listen to those comments of children. I mean, it might be that they don't know why they feel uncomfortable, but, they might just, for a scent, they don't feel safe with that person. So if there is, if you're in the community, a community member or a teacher or a parent who is worried that their child or children are being groomed, they need to talk to someone. So very important to, have a conversation with authority in these areas. Just look up, what is grooming, and Alyssa's already, I'm sure, will make available some information about what is grooming. And if those signs are there and you really still feel concerned, then you can ring the police or you can ring the child protection authorities. Or if they're concerned about someone's child in particular, then have a talk to those parents. But I think the important thing is don't ignore it. If you're feeling uncomfortable or you're worried, then you've got to also think, how does that child actually feel with that person? So really, engage with those feelings, those suspicions, and don't ignore them. I don't know, Alyssa, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think I would completely agree. I mean, I think it's something we all need to understand more. And I think we talk quite a lot about being alert, being curious, paying attention actually, and really kind of leaning in to what's happening, because actually paying attention is a really, really, really useful way for you to, I guess, gather the information and kind of process it and understand it. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because often if we're not sure, we'll turn away. We don't know the answer, we're not quite sure, and we'll turn away. So I think, one of the most simple things that we can do is be curious and pay attention. And if we pay attention, we will see things. We will see things if we're concerned. So I think, you can kind of strip it back to kind of paying attention and being curious, I think. And then, then it is, I think, I guess, just to take your point around, get advice, talk to somebody and get some advice. And, what a child needs you to do is to do something. That's what a child needs you to do. Just do something, not nothing. And that something might be get advice and do the next thing. It might not be you do everything, but you do the next thing. And so I think, kind of there is some fear around it that comes back to, I need to kind of manage this situation. But if you pay attention and then you get some advice, I think they're good kind of basic foundations that we can think about for all community members.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists today. It's been such a rich and insightful conversation. So to Dr. Camilla Bastian, Alyssa Hall and Sophie McAvoy, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your insights. We've really enjoyed talking with you all today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.